George Washington Part 1, From Plantation Boy to Provincial Officer, where he's 1732-1754. Chapter 1, A Virginian by Birth. Their birth, family, and early environment. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County in the Tidewater region of colonial Virginia, a British possession along the Atlantic seaboard of North America. He entered the world not as a poor commoner and not as a great aristocrat, but as the son of a middling planter family that owned land and enslaved laborers, placing him in the broad middle ranks of Virginia's gentry. This environment, shaped by tobacco agriculture, the Anglican Church, and a rigid social hierarchy, formed the backdrop of his early years and planted many of the ideas and habits that would later influence his leadership. His father, Augustine Washington, had been born into modest circumstances for a planter, but gradually improved his position through marriage, land acquisition, and business ventures. Augustine owned several plantations and engaged in ironworks and other enterprises, reflecting the entrepreneurial spirit of many colonial landowners who sought to diversify beyond tobacco when possible. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, came from a family of some standing but without great wealth. Their marriage united two respectable but not top-tier families within Virginia's stratified society, giving George a background that combined aspiration with a need for advancement through effort. In the 1730s and 1740s, Virginia was a slave society, and the Washington household was no exception. Enslaved Africans and African Americans worked the fields, maintained the homes, and contributed to the family's fortunes. As a child, George grew up surrounded by this system, seeing enslaved people as part of the daily fabric of plantation life. It was an arrangement accepted and rarely questioned in his world, even though it stood in tension with later ideals of liberty and equality that he would champion in the Revolutionary era. Washington's early years involved several moves that reflected his father's land holdings and ambitions. He was born at Pope's Creek, also known as Wakefield, but the family later relocated to a property near the Rappahannock River outside Fredericksburg, often referred to as Ferry Farm. These moves exposed him to different parts of Virginia's landscape and economy. Riverfront plantations tied to Atlantic trade, small local communities, and the rhythms of tobacco cultivation and export. The young Washington thus experienced Virginia as a network of plantations, waterways, and emerging towns, all tied into the broader British Empire. In 1743, when George was about 11, Augustine Washington died, leaving Mary Ball Washington a widow with several children. This event significantly affected George's path. Augustine's death meant that the family's properties were divided among his children from two marriages, with the eldest son from the first marriage inheriting the main estate at what would later be Mount Vernon. George received a smaller inheritance, land and some enslaved people, but not at the principal family seat. This inheritance pattern, common in Virginia, both constrained and motivated him. He was not destitute, but he also was not fully established. He would need to rely on his own efforts, connections, and talents to rise. Mary Washington's strong-willed nature and protective approach to her children influenced George's discipline and sense of duty. She managed Ferry Farm and kept close control over finances, which sometimes frustrated her ambitious son, who yearned for opportunities beyond the farm. Nonetheless, the combination of moderate means, exposure to plantation management, and a network of relatives and neighbors in the gentry placed George Washington in a position to seek advancement in a society that rewarded land, honor, and service. Chapter 2, Learning the Measure of Land, education, character, and surveying. Unlike some of his later compatriots, such as John Adams or Thomas Jefferson, George Washington did not receive a classical education or attend college. His schooling was relatively brief and practical, focusing on basic literacy, arithmetic, and business skills. Yet he displayed a serious and self-directed approach to learning, reflecting an early understanding that self-discipline could compensate for limited formal education. As a youth, Washington copied and studied a collection of rules of civility and decent behavior, which offered guidance on manners, self-control, and social interaction. This exercise was more than rote writing. It became part of his lifelong effort to cultivate a composed, courteous, and dignified public persona. He learned to listen more than he spoke in large gatherings, to control his temper, and to conduct himself in a way that earned respect. These habits would later define his leadership style, where he often communicated more through presence and example than through elaborate speeches. Mathematics and geometry, which he absorbed in his youth, proved valuable when he pursued surveying. The profession of surveying had practical importance in a colony where land speculation and westward expansion were constant concerns. Through family connections, including the powerful Fairfax family, Washington obtained opportunities as a young surveyor in the Shenandoah Valley and along Virginia's frontier. In his mid-teens, he joined expeditions to map and measure lands beyond the settled Tidewater region, often enduring rugged conditions, simple lodgings, and exposure to the elements. This surveying work shaped Washington in several ways. First, it honed technical skills. He learned to use compasses, chains, and other instruments with precision. Second, it gave him an intimate understanding of the American landscape, rivers, mountains, forests, and routes. That would later be crucial in military planning. Third, it exposed him directly to the tensions and opportunities of the frontier, where indigenous nations, colonial settlers, and land companies all had competing claims. On these journeys, Washington interacted with indigenous peoples, traders, and frontier settlers. And he witnessed both the possibilities of land and the conflicts over who would control it. From an early American perspective, land represented wealth, status, and security. Washington's experiences confirmed that those who understood and controlled land would shape the future of the colonies. He began to invest in land himself, building a personal stake in the westward movement that would later intersect with imperial rivalries between Britain and France. The work also taught him resilience and resourcefulness. Nights spent in makeshift shelters, dealing with weather, illness, and the uncertainties of travel, toughened him physically and mentally. Washington developed a capacity to endure hardship without complaint, a trait that would become legendary during later campaigns in the Revolutionary War. He also gained confidence in his ability to manage men and projects, as he sometimes led small surveying parties and coordinated logistics. By his late teens, Washington was emerging as a young man with a mix of practicality and ambition. While he lacked the polish and education of some older Virginia gentlemen, he compensated with industry, reliability, and a growing reputation for competence. Surveying had given him a firm foundation in land, leadership, and self-sufficiency, skills that prepared him for the next phase of his life as a provincial officer and participant in imperial conflict. Chapter 3. An ambitious young Virginian, social aspirations and first steps into public life. In mid-18th century Virginia, social status was based on a combination of birth, land ownership, wealth, and personal conduct. George Washington understood this hierarchy keenly and sought to climb within it. His early interactions with the Fairfax family, particularly Lord Fairfax and his relatives, who owned extensive lands near Mount Vernon, provided him with models of aristocratic lifestyle as well as valuable patronage. The Fairfaxes saw promise in the serious, capable young man and helped open doors for him. Washington carefully cultivated the appearance of a gentleman. He paid attention to dress, posture, and conversation, learning to move comfortably in elite circles even as he remained aware of his relatively modest beginnings. He kept accounts and correspondence in a meticulous hand, building a reputation for orderliness and trustworthiness. He also practiced riding and hunting, skills prized among Virginia's gentry and later essential for a military commander. Despite his ambitions, Washington's path was not guaranteed. His inheritance, while not negligible, did not secure the kind of independent fortune that some of his peers possessed. To advance, he would need both service and opportunity. The Virginia militia offered one such avenue. Militia service was simultaneously a duty and a chance for recognition. Officers could display bravery, leadership, and loyalty, winning the respect of their community and potentially earning royal commissions. When the colonial government in Williamsburg sought to strengthen its defenses and assert claims in the Ohio Valley, Washington was well positioned to volunteer. His surveying experience, knowledge of the frontier, and connections with influential families made him an attractive candidate. He began receiving militia appointments in the early 1750s, first at lesser ranks and then with increasing responsibility. At the same time, Washington was beginning to participate more in public affairs. He observed debates over land policy, defense, and relations with indigenous nations. Though still young, he had developed a sense of himself as someone who could contribute to Virginia's security and prosperity. His ambition was not purely personal. It was intertwined with a belief in the colony's rights and its role within the British Empire. Yet, Washington remained conscious of the need to prove himself. He carefully recorded his activities and sought to present them in a favorable light to superiors and potential patrons. He knew that success in military ventures, especially on the contested frontier, could propel him forward. The stage was set for him to step into a larger role as tensions between Britain and France in North America escalated. Chapter 4, The Edge of Empire, The Road to the 7 Years' War. By the early 1750s, the Ohio Valley and surrounding regions had become a focal point of imperial rivalry. Both Britain and France laid claim to the territory, while indigenous nations, including the Iroquois and various Ohio Valley tribes, pursued their own interests and alliances. Land companies backed by Virginia interests, such as the Ohio Company, sought to survey and settle lands west of the Appalachians, envisioning profitable expansion. The French responded by building a chain of forts from the Great Lakes down toward the Ohio River, aiming to link their holdings in Canada with those along the Mississippi. British officials in Virginia and London interpreted this move as a direct challenge to their chartered claims and future expansion. A clash seemed increasingly likely, even if no one yet anticipated the global scale of the eventual conflict, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, would reach. In this fraught context, the governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, decided to send a diplomatic mission to warn the French to withdraw from what Britain considered its territory. In late 1753, he selected George Washington, then about 21 years old, to carry his letter to French commanders in the Ohio region. This assignment placed Washington at the heart of imperial maneuvering and demonstrated the confidence colonial authorities had begun to place in him. The journey was arduous. Washington traveled hundreds of miles through wilderness, accompanied by a small party that included a guide and an interpreter. He crossed rivers, braved harsh winter conditions, and navigated territories where alliances and tensions were complex. He met with indigenous leaders to assess their positions and seek support, learning firsthand about the diplomatic landscape beyond the settled colonies. Upon reaching the French outposts, Washington delivered Dinwiddie's message and received a polite but firm reply. The French intended to remain and build additional fortifications. Washington's detailed journal of the mission, later published, provided valuable intelligence on French strength and positions, as well as an account that burnished his own reputation as a capable and courageous agent of the colony. The failure of diplomacy only heightened tensions. In early 1754, as the French moved to solidify their position at a strategic site where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers meet to form the Ohio, future Pittsburgh, Dinwiddie authorized a military expedition to assert British claims. Washington, now appointed a lieutenant colonel in the Virginia militia, was tasked with leading advance forces into the contested area. This assignment marked a clear transition in Washington's life, from surveyor, ambitious young planter, and militia officer to central actor in the opening phases of a war that would soon engulf much of the world. As he marched into the Ohio country, he was stepping onto the edge of empire, where his actions would have consequences far beyond his own career. The episodes that followed, including the skirmish at Jumonville Glen and the construction and surrender of Fort Necessity, would serve as a harsh initiation into the realities of war and leadership, and they would begin to shape how Americans and Britons alike viewed this young Virginian. Washington stands on the verge of his first major military test. His upbringing in colonial Virginia, his practical education and surveying experience, and his carefully cultivated ambitions have prepared him to seize opportunities and endure hardship. The coming conflict in the Ohio Valley will test those qualities severely and begin the process of transforming him from a provincial officer into a figure of imperial and eventually national significance. Do not use any music for this video.